Hey everybody, what's going on? We're in the studio today talking about a very important issue that's often neglected around the country, and that's our environment. I'm joined today by award-winning author Jason W. Moore, who co-wrote the book, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. Jason, welcome.
Thank you.
So first of all, I have to ask you, how are you liking your visit to Point
It's
Park?
been great.
Okay.
Great audience earlier today and great to be here with you.
Yes, of course. You were here talking about your book and also about the environment. You had a master class, or more so of a discussion, right?
Well, we had a great lecture, it turns out, and a fantastic audience, great questions from the students and the faculty, talking about how do we make sense of the big issues of our times. Above all, how do we understand climate change as not just a thing out here, but as a crisis of the whole ways of life and of exercising power and of running economies in the modern world.
Right. And you mentioned that there is a very intertwined connection between humans and nature, and we're not as different as we think we are.
Well, absolutely, because the conceit, the fantasy is really that there's a separation. There's nature somehow out there in the countryside with the mountains and the fields and the forests and the streams. And then there's our lives here in downtown Pittsburgh. But of course, this too is an ecosystem right here. And it's an ecosystem not just of critters and human beings and disease organisms and dirt and all the rest of it. It's also an ecology of power and of economic life. And until we begin to put all of those moments together and stop seeing the environment as something out there that needs to be saved or protected, but rather as part of the fundamental questions of equity and justice, then we won't be able to deal with the climate crisis.
When you mention power, I think of the sociological term, or the equation rather, of man minus nature, right? Is that kind of where you're getting this from?
So it's a funny thing. We learn that humans and nature are these innocent descriptions of the world around us. But in fact, when we go back into the history of the making of the modern world, all the way back to Columbus and Columbus's invasion of the New World in 1492, we see the emergence of these guiding principles on the part of the world's 1% and of their empires to say, here's civilization and here's nature and here's the thing that is hard to see until we put it in these terms, that most human beings were put into the realm not of civilization, but of nature. So civilized human beings were white guys who were literate, who had power, who had money, and then women and peoples of color, indigenous peoples, were all put into this realm of nature, and that's important because they could be treated cheaply and they could be turned into profit-making opportunities.
Well, I think that's a really powerful statement, and I think that we do see a lot of that, especially with social injustice, whenever it comes to women, whenever it comes to race. This is something that is extremely modern and current, right? And also, I want to ask you, I do want to talk about the title of your book, The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. Can you describe what that means? That's a really powerful title.
Well, cheapness is never a bargain. That's the first thing. People say, well, isn't it good that I can go to McDonald's and get a $1 hamburger? But there's tremendous violence that goes through the making of that hamburger, of that $1 or $2 hamburger. But there's also cheapness, not just in terms of price, but cheapness in the other meaning of the word, to cheapen or to degrade or to disrespect. So one of the themes in the book that we talk about are cheap lives. And we talk about whose lives and whose work matters, whose is valued, and whose is cheapened, not just to cheapen in price, but to treat with less dignity, to treat with less respect, to say that in the words of the Spanish conquerors, indigenous peoples were naturales, they were part of nature, or to talk about people in Africa as monsters, or to treat women as the savages of Europe. These were all terms and words that were used in the 16th and 17th centuries, and guess what? That's changed, but not by a whole lot.
Who designs this hierarchy? I mean, where does this originate from?
Well, that's a great question, because usually we think of the modern world as something that's very recent, maybe over the past 50 years or 100 years, or maybe we go back to England with the Industrial Revolution. And Raj Patel and I want to say, no, there's a longer history to that goes back to Columbus, goes back to the invasions of the New World, goes back to the genocides, but then we also point to the ways that the modern relations of making empires and waging wars and exploiting people, but also the cheap work of the rest of nature, of trees and soils, shapes this world that sees making money as an end to itself. And so what we're highlighting is the ways that this weird system emerged. And it's not that markets are a problem as such. It's not that many of the things we associate with capitalism are necessarily a problem, because all of those things existed long before 1492. But in this world, we saw the rise of Western Europe to global power. And that was primarily a process of armed force and then using weapons to create profit-making opportunities. So we live in the United States. This is an era, this is a place made through the genocide of Native Americans and the enslaving of Africans in this country. And those processes have not ended. Sometimes you go to places and they say, well, just get over it. But we know that the world color line especially was forged in this period and is still very much with us, and we see it in the climate crisis. And that's important, because if we want to deal with climate, we have to deal with race.
What, you know, I have to say, that is a connection that I personally have never heard, and I think that a lot of other people probably have never really heard as well. You're making a connection between race and the environment. Can you break that down? How does those two items pertain to each other?
Well, this is an argument pioneered by advocates of environmental justice in the United States and then across the world in the global South. But in the United States, starting in 1987 with the United Church of Christ report on what we now call environmental racism, guess what? The most toxic places in the South were also places where folks of color were living. And that's one layer of it, but it in fact goes deeper. So one part of that process, sometimes called environmental racism, is that populations of color bear disproportionate costs, disproportionate violence of environmental damage. When we look at the world color line and how it relates to climate change, we see that the costs of climate change are imposed disproportionately on people of color. And guess what? It's not just climate apartheid, it is climate patriarchy, because women worldwide, and especially across the global South, the regions of the world most affected by climate change, who are also women of color, are bearing disproportionate costs in the health of their children, the struggle to provision their lives just on a daily basis. So we have to take any politics to deal with climate change as a politics that deals squarely with issues of global inequality, race, class, gender.
I do want to pick that apart just a tad bit so that people can also try to grasp this and leave with a sense of understanding. So when we say that you know, the cost of the environment, things that are happening negatively, I mean, you mentioned climate change, that's being sort of juxtaposed onto women and race. How are they seeing it? How are they paying for it? What are some of the costs that, you know, are affecting them that they may not realize they're getting hit with?
Well, a classic example is the series of hurricanes that we've seen since Katrina in 2005 in New Orleans, but also notably Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. These places are declared environmental sacrifice zones by the 1%, by the federal government, and seen as an opportunity to make a profit. So let's go into New Orleans after Katrina and privatize all the schools so we can make a profit of the horrific disaster of Hurricane Katrina. So there's an old expression about this: there's no such thing as a natural disaster. We talk about a hurricane like, oh, it's just a hurricane. But once we ask, just as your question asks, who pays the price for these devastating hurricanes? It is always working class folks, folks of color, women in these areas, places like Katrina in New Orleans and the effects of Maria on Puerto Rico, which is still devastated by these transformations. So once we begin to ask, how are processes that we call natural, like a hurricane, related to processes of social justice? And we begin to see how they are so intimately connected, we can't really pull them apart. It's impossible to talk about the problem, say, in America of racism without understanding how it is linked to, say, cash crop agriculture and plantation agriculture. And then once we start to look at that, we start to see, oh, what is it that's driving climate change? Well, burning fossil fuels. When did that take off? The Industrial Revolution in England. But that only takes off because of racialized labor in the American South growing cotton. And where did they get the land to grow the cotton in the first place? By moving all the Indians and killing all the indigenous peoples out of there. So we begin to see how one after another, the questions of race and power and sustainability are all linked up to each other.
Locally, in the tri-state area, there are a lot of surrounding extraction states. A lot of these communities, like in West Virginia or Ohio, are having their environments ripped apart through coal mining and fracking. Do people there see this type of effect as well?
Well, absolutely. You can see in West Virginia, for instance, there's now a long-running campaign against mountaintop removal, which is about as horrible as it sounds. And it ends up not just blowing up the mountaintops, but also completely polluting their living spaces, their streams, their air, everything else. And it also connects to, while there are plenty of people of color in a place like West Virginia is also in Appalachia. Appalachians haven't really been white in American history. They've been white trash. There are ways of talking about how these people are not really part of good society. They're not part of civilized society. They're out there in the wild somehow, not quite part of civilization. And so there is a tremendous tension in all of these places around fracking with natural gas, mountaintop removal, which is not just increasingly expensive, but also so toxic and so dangerous. And they all face the either-or proposition of the politicians, jobs or environment. That's in fact completely false. It's completely technically and economically feasible to shift to solar and wind.
Wow, so many things. Surely this will all be unpacked in your book. Where can that be purchased if people want it?
Well, Amazon or a lot of bookstores as well. A History of the World and 7 Cheap Things. We wrote it for people who are really interested in the big questions of our times. It's not for academics. It's for students. It's for activists. It's for people who want to learn how to make the world a better place.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on, and safe travels back to New York.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right, everybody. Well, reporting from the CMI, I'm Royce Jones for Point News.